You
Okay.
are on the record.
I'm going to see how many times I'm going to mess up with this
What?
with this Zoom thing. This is a new concept for me, to be here and not here at the same time. But welcome to the 5 of us. 3 are here physically, 2 who are there virtually. We are here to learn. The title of the class is What We Believe. Now, it's a little bit of a bombastic title because, of course, you're not going to be able to cover everything that Judaism believes in 3 one-hour lessons. No chance. What?
It's a good start.
Is that my belief? That's belief number 1. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, very good. So, however, luckily, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, known in Jewish circles as the Rambam, known in the rest of the world as Maimonides, in his commentary on the Mishnah, when there is in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, there is a discussion of who are the Jews who would be considered apostates and what does it matter. But he decides, you know what, let me tackle this. What does it take for a Jew to be considered an apostate? Now, before I even go there, I'm not calling anybody apostate. I won't call anybody apostate for numerous different reasons. But this is just the Rambam's way of getting into the topic. Because suppose there is a Jew who believes in everything. He's an amazing guy or woman. But he believes that, on Shabbos, the Shabbos doesn't begin at sunset, but at dusk. Okay, I'm just throwing out a little detail of Jewish law. Are you going to call this guy an apostate? Hardly. Is he wrong? I'd say that he is wrong, or she. But I would say that there are certain things in Judaism that even if they are important, they still don't affect, largely don't affect the rest of our beliefs. So if you have a wrong belief about the mitzvah of kosher, or a wrong belief about how to celebrate Shabbos, or a wrong belief about many of the other practices of Judaism, or even beliefs of Judaism, it may be that this is a personal issue or difficulty that you have, you or whatever, this hypothetical Jewish person, but the foundations are true, are solid. Similar to a building where there may be a problem, there may be a brick missing, there may be a broken window, there may be a bunch of different issues. But if it has a strong foundation, everything else is by and large good. Whereas if the foundation is weak, even if right now the walls look fine, everything looks fine, the foundation is weak. But that story, that bridge yesterday, you hit one of these supporting foundations, the bridge falls apart quickly. So Maimonides tried to formulate a list of 13 things which he considered to be, each one of these beliefs to be foundational to the Jewish system, so to speak, the system of beliefs. Take any one of these 13 things away, and your Judaism is not just has a flaw. None of us are perfect. But in his view, it's fatally flawed. You're missing the whole thing. Your whole foundation is weak. Now, mind you, Maimonides is not the only one who tried. And many people, like in solid Jewish tradition, many disagreed with some of the principles on both counts. Some said that there are more things which are foundational to Jewish belief. Others said that some of the things he mentioned are not so central to Jewish belief. Some argued with some of the details of how he formulated them. But by and large, his attempt became the central thing around which people argue. So you will find arguments about almost everything he says. I mean, of course, God exists. The Torah is true. The basics are there. But you will find a lot of discussion. Books were written about this, for and against, or commentary and whatnot. In fact, if you will look, my personal name, Noson Gurary, you will find a book on the 13 Principles of Faith by Rabbi Noson Gurary. That's not me. It's my father's brother who taught classes in the subject, and one of his students put it together in book form. And that's what he's famous for. And every time I got to, compete with his fame. It's one of several books he wrote. But until today, 800 plus years later, the principles as formulated by Maimonides, by the Rambam, they form the kind of, this is the standard. You want to deviate a little bit of his standards, you want to add, you want to take off, but he's the gold standard. That's where you go back to. And in fact, in many prayer books, it is a custom in many synagogues that at the end of the morning prayer, some do it every day, some do it only on Shabbos, they have a list of paragraphs, each beginning with the words in Hebrew, Ani Ma'amin, I believe. I believe with complete faith, and it goes through 13 paragraphs. It's not in our siddur, it's not in the Chabad siddur, but it's not because we don't believe in the 13 principles. It's because it didn't make it into our siddur for, the other things that were considered to be more important in the prayer side. But this is a standard thing. So what we're going to do over the next 3 weeks, or at least attempt to do, is to go over these things. And in each of these things, of these principles, we're going to talk about it from two different angles. And this is something, it's my personal thing. Actually, when I was preparing for this class, I discovered that I did something similar, something like 15 years ago. Oh, you were older than me, so maybe you were there, who knows? 15 years ago. And I wrote notes, and here's the thing. And I'll start with the question before we get into the actual meat and potatoes to get to the subject lesson. The question is, are these things we believe, we take it on faith? Or are these things we understand, we argue, we have proven it to ourselves, and therefore we know them to be true because it's logical, because you can prove it. If you have somebody who disagrees, you will ultimately back and forth discuss it, and you'll be able to prove your point. This is valid, this is truth, because anything else is simply not true. So which is it? Which leads to a broader question. What is our relationship with the Jewish faith? Is it something we know to be true, or is it something we believe? I often ask the question, do we believe in God, or do I know God exists? I hear somebody answering, or maybe it was just background noise.
Both.
Okay. It was both background noise and someone answering.
Both believe in God and both know He exists.
So the answer really is, first of all, yes, you are correct. We believe and we also know. But what does that mean? It means that our knowledge takes us until a certain point, but there are in every one of the 13 principles, there is a certain amount where you could arrive at with pure logic. And then there's going to be an element which is based on faith, which if you were to try only with logic and nobody would whisper into your ear that this is the fact, this is the way things are, I may not have concluded that on my own, or at least I would have been doubtful about it. But because the Torah is true, God told us certain realities, we take it on faith. Or, to say it differently, there are things we know logically, and there are things we know because we simply know. We can't prove it, but in our gut, we know them to be true. It is a Jewish view, not one of the 13 principles of the Jewish faith, but it is still a thing that is a concept which is talked about a lot in Jewish circles, that since we are God's creatures, we were created in God's image, there are certain truths which it's almost an instinct. We believe them and we know them to be true, even if we don't always have the ability to formulate it in words, certainly not to prove it. So that doesn't mean that we're not going to prove. We're going to try to learn as much as we can with logic. And then we're going to acknowledge which are the areas which perhaps logic doesn't prove it. We're going to go a little further than that. That's the way I tried to do this class, and we'll see how successful I am. Yes, David?
Suppose there's a conflict between belief and necessity. And I have some examples. For example, the way Israel began is the modern Israel began, is you had Jews who lived in Israel before it was even a state and all that. I think they were known as Sabras, and they contributed a lot to Israel's independence.
Mm-hmm.
But in doing that, it probably was difficult to keep the Shabbos. And then,
So this question could be answered on many levels.
okay.
I'll answer it in the narrow sense.
Okay.
Within Jewish law, there are rules of how to deal with a conflict when life conflicts with what the Torah wants us to do. So generally speaking, whenever you're faced with such a life question, you could find the answer within the system. You don't have to drop the system to deal with life, but the system itself is designed to give you guidelines on how it works. For example, God forbid, there's a life-threatening situation. There's no Shabbos right now. You just go ahead and you do it. And however, there are situations where the Torah tells us this is worthy of giving your life up for.
Well,
So there is a system, but I don't think that's directly related to the 13 principles of the Jewish faith, unless they're going to explain your question.
There is a situation that's going on right now. I have a cousin who lives in Akko,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm in touch with him, and they were under threat and all that stuff. And we've been talking about the politics in Israel, and of course, they have a lot of constriction going on. But he said there are laws and a lot of arguments about whether Orthodox.
Oh, that's a major topic.
Yes.
If you want, I can give you my piece of my mind about that subject, but after the class, if you wish. Okay, I don't want to hog this situation.
Okay,
There's a
but
lot of
that's
stuff
an
to
example
cover.
of-
Okay. Okay. Yes.
The concept of belief.
Mm-hmm.
Can I say, I casually say to people
Mm-hmm.
all the time, I believe in God. What about God? Well, I believe in the God that led the Jews out of Egypt, out of slavery, the God who gave the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. I say that casually, but I don't live like I don't live that way.
May I make a
don't keep
suggestion?
Shabbos.
I'm going to make a suggestion. Okay. Hold this question,
Mhm.
and at the end of the third lesson,
Okay.
see what you feel about that question.
Okay.
Okay. Because we're taking this slowly. Let's take principle number one. We'll start with that. Okay? I'm going to read the principle, loosely translating the paragraph as it is said in many people's prayer books. I don't think it's in the Reform or Conservative prayer book. Why don't I think so? I don't know. I didn't check. It's because I believe that they have a problem with some of these principles. But in many Orthodox prayer books, it's there. More in Sephardic, because Maimonides was a Sephardic Jew, one of the great Sephardic rabbis. But some Ashkenazi prayer books fell because he's respected to everybody. He was a great man, a philosopher, rabbi, doctor. If you should look him up if you haven't heard much about him. Whatever the case is, the first principle shouldn't be no surprise to anybody. If you're going to believe in the Jewish religion, it all starts with a belief in a creator, right? So let's start with how this paragraph is said. Again, loosely translated. I believe with perfect faith that the creator, blessed be his name, is the author and guide of everything that has been created. And that he alone has made, does make, and will make all things. That's the way that principle is formulated. Now, Maimonides himself, for each of the principles, has many paragraphs. He doesn't write it on one page. But this is the short version, the way, again, more or less, it is repeated by many communities in their synagogues at the end of the prayer. So you get up or you sit down, wherever you do at the end of the prayer, and you say, I believe with perfect faith that what? That the creator, blessed be his name, he created everything that he alone and nothing else or no one else created or will create anything. Okay? So let me throw out the question. And by the way, the two students who are online are being very quiet. So I don't know if you are trying to say things and I don't hear you. I don't want to ignore you. If you have something to say, please feel free to join the conversation. The question I want to throw out to you, and without giving the background, just I want to hear a kind of yes or no, a one-word answer. Do you believe that God exists, or do you know he exists?
I believe.
Believe?
I believe.
Believe.
You believe. Okay. You don't know that he exists.
I don't think we're supposed to know.
Hmm?
I have no proof
You have. Okay.
that I know of.
Lee, what do you think? What do you say?
I definitely believe, and I would have to say I know he exists from my experiences in life.
You say you know. Okay. And Fran, I think you want to be quiet. I don't see you, so up to you. Okay. If you want to chime in, feel free. So the average person on the street, I've got to say, just in my experience, most people, if you're asked to give the instinctive answer without thinking it through, they will answer like most people did right now. I believe. They will assume that it's not possible to truly prove it. And on some level, that's correct, because the way things are typically proven in modern days by measurements,
Yes.
instruments that, it's solid. You can hold it in your hand. That type of proof you're not going to find about God, because God is not captured in these instruments. He's true on a different level. But when you ask yourself about logical proof, or to put it differently, okay, the world exists. It came about somehow. Everybody agrees to that, right? Is it more or less logical to believe that it happened because a creator created it? Or is it perhaps more logical to believe, as many people out there believe, that it happened on its own? That there was a random process that happened over billions, trillions, whatever, the various theories that are out there, primarily the theory of evolution in its various variations. Yes.
May I suggest the difference between proof and evidence?
Okay. Yeah, fair point.
Proof is conclusive, and evidence means that, I see this, it points to the answer, and that's where I come from.
So I want to give, I'm not going to give any, look, there are books and books that are written about it by Jewish philosophers, by other philosophers, and you're not going to get everything from me on one foot. But if you ask me, I will say that I believe that for the average person, for the lay person, not for the deep philosopher, you could easily arrive at a conclusion that the world, it's more logical to believe, and therefore simpler and satisfactory to the average person to understand that the world came about because someone decided to create it. And I'll explain, it's a relatively simple way. I have tried this on 12-year-old boys whom I have been preparing for the bar mitzvah. Okay. And I try this with a simplistic, I will admit. What I'm going to say is not going to be any very deep thing. Simplistic argument. Unfortunately, I'm realizing now it's already 8:20. I'm going to have to start accelerating but here is this. There's a famous story of the mythical city of fools called Chelm. Ever heard of the Chelm? In Yiddish literature, they took a city in Poland, a real city that actually exists, had a large Jewish population, was called Chelm. And some author decided to describe them as the ultimate fools. And a number of jokes and tales are told about the Jewish people of Chelm. Look up Chelm stories online. You'll find a number of cute ones. So the story, as it is told in this context, is about the people of Chelm who heard that there's this new invention, and they call it a train. And they are going to, this train actually is a wagon, not just wagon, but a whole series of wagons. And it travels with no horses. Big argument, of course, broke out. True, not true, must be a hoax, can't be, right? So the people of Chelm decided they're going to send a delegation of 3 of the wisest men of Chelm. They're going to go there for 7 days, an expedition to the train station. And they're going to come back and give a report of whether this is true or not. And of course, the train doesn't come, every 5 minutes. Several times a day, there's a train which passes by the train station where they went. And the train has a bunch of, carts? Wagons? It has a bunch of them. Let's say it has 20, whatever, doesn't matter. And they decided to be methodical. So the first train to pull into the station, it went to the last one. Last car. And through observation, they have proved, in fact, that it does not go alone. Even though there are no horses, it doesn't go on its own. They determined that there is a car before it to which it is hitched, and this 19th cart is pulling it. But they didn't rest there. They decided to investigate further. And they, next train, they went, the 18th pulls the 19th. The 17th pulled the 16th. And they continue to investigate deeper and deeper and deeper. In fact, by the time their 7 days were over, they have determined that the second car is pulled by the first. And then they came over, they ran out of time, the mandate was up. And they said, look, we didn't conclusively prove that they're going on, it's not going on its own. But all the evidence we have from all the 19 cars we investigated proves that none of them went on their own. And therefore, we can safely assume that the first one also doesn't go on its own. And therefore, the whole thing is a hoax. That's the way the tale goes.
The whole thing is a hoax.
The whole idea that a train goes on its own is the hoax. Because we did the investigated for 19 trains. None of the 19 went on their own. Why should I assume that the first one goes on its own?
Therefore, the first one.
Probably also not, right? Is it logical? On some level it is. But on a practical level it isn't, because they didn't begin to tackle the problem. Because all of their 7 days of investigation didn't deal with the essence of the problem, which is who's pulling the first one. That's where they should have started. And they didn't get there. So therefore, they spent 7 days, but they didn't get anywhere, didn't really begin to answer the question. And this goes directly to our discussion, right? To the extent that we all instinctively realize that the world came, it wasn't always here. Science agrees to that. Certainly the world wasn't always here as we know it now. And science agrees there's a process. It's only that science continues to go from the last car towards the first. And it continues to dig. And in this class, we're not going to discuss evolution, true or not, because that's not relevant to our discussion,
Right.
Whether the world is here for 6,000 years or 6 billion years. The relevant question is, where did it all start from? Right? Now, logically, we know there has to be a beginning. However you determine it, there has to be a beginning. Everything we know needs something else that caused it to happen. So logically, there's no end.
But what bothers me is that we defer the question.
That's exactly
and
the
put
point.
It on to
Everything science
God.
does is deferring the question from the 20th to the 19th to the 18th car, but it's not dealing with, it was never meant to deal with the first question, which is, where does the process start from? Because even if you're going to take, like, what am I? I'm no scientist. But if you're going to take the view that it all started with a singular point, and time, space, and all energy and matter, everything started from only one point, and then it's suddenly Big Bang, and it started. Well, what's caused the Big Bang? What caused the Big Bang? There was a time that it wasn't there. Okay, there's no time, but something caused it. Yes, because the system arranged. Who created that system? Logically, there was nothing you could get at that is the beginning, unless the only logical conclusion is that there is a point somewhere early on in the chain for which the question, where did it come from, cannot be asked, doesn't apply.
Right.
There has to be a beginning, which is because it is, not because something made it, not because it has to be, not because there's some system that preceded it. It just is, right? There has to be some start. Now, you could argue from today till whenever, what is the process from point number one to where we are today? And that's a valid discussion. But there has to be a point number one logically. And furthermore, that point number one must be a thing or being or whatever that is, by definition, undefined.
Yeah.
Why does it have to be undefined?
Not physical.
Not spiritual, not any definition. Why does it have to be undefined? Because anytime you will define that, any way you will describe that point A, you will automatically end up with the question, why did that point A end up this way and not a different way? And you'll have to answer, it's because of a preceding reason which caused point A to be as it is. Well, it's not point A anymore. Logically, whatever is point A, however you're going to define it, has to be something that has no limits, that has no boundaries, that has no definitions. Because any limit, boundary, definition, whatever it may be, means that it preceded point A. So when we say we believe in God, what are we really saying? we're saying there is a point A, which is totally abstract, always was, simply because the whole construct, the whole idea, the whole logic that something has to come from somewhere applies when you're talking about a thing that is made in a certain way, is in a certain way, behaves in a certain way. You can ask why. But if something has no limits, no boundaries, and no definitions, why is it? Because it is. That's it. That point is what me and you call God, with one caveat. Till now, we didn't yet say that that thing or that point A has a conscience. Maybe just is.
We do
Right.
give it a definition.
What's the definition?
Well, it created the world.
No.
It
we're
cares
getting
about us.
in the 13 principles. We're going to get to that. We didn't yet decide that it cares. We're now discussing principle number 1. Principle 1 is that there is a point from which everything came, and that point made a conscious decision to create. Why does that have to be? Because if that point did not make a conscious decision to create, it just happened automatically, obviously there is some system, i.e. a preceding reason, which caused it to have to happen a certain way. No, that's no longer point A. There's a point before point A. That's not what we're discussing. So even if you're going to argue, if you believe at this point that they're angels or beings or processes or evolutions, whatever you describe, a system which causes the world to happen, maybe I'll give it to you for now. But that's not God. Because what we call God is the point A. That's all. And once you realize that there is a point A, then I believe with complete faith that this point A, we didn't call him God yet. I mean, is the creator. And that everything that ever happened and will happen, or was created and will be created, ultimately starts from there. We're not yet discussing the idea that if he did it directly or he did it through a process which scientists may call today evolution, or some other process which they may describe in the future. For now, what's relevant to us is that there is a beginning to everything. That beginning is an undefined being, can't have any definitions, because as soon as you give it a definition, it can no longer be point A.
Yeah.
And that being has a conscious, or has a self-awareness, ability to decide at will, and decided to put into place, either poof, created the whole world, or if you would rather believe in a 10 billion or whatever billion years of evolution, if that makes you sleep better at night, so be it for now. But ultimately, it was his decision, and therefore it doesn't matter. For the sake of this principle, what matters is there's a creator that started everything. And by the way, if the creator exists and he decided to create a world, it's logical to assume that there's some purpose. It's less logical to believe that he just was, like Einstein says, I don't think God is what do they say? He doesn't play dice with the universe or something like that. Right. To believe that the creator decided to create because he was bored and there was no rhyme or reason for everything. Who knows? It could be, but it's less logical than assuming that if something was done, he won something out of it. Okay. So that's principle number 1. And as far as I'm concerned, this is basic logic. Now, is this scientific? No. Science has a different way to prove it's not something, but in day-to-day life, if you're looking around, you're asking yourself the basic life's questions, to me, this is as logical as it comes. It's simple. I know all the years I've been teaching this, it's not as if I'm the biggest scientist or the biggest debater or all not, but nobody ever came to me with an alternate theory which allows for everything to start from a point A, which is not God. What people do have is different definitions. They were never thought of God that way. And therefore, when you ask, do you believe in God? They think of some old man from the Bible who's an angry old man. Okay, I don't believe in that God either. But if you define God as the beginning of everything, the abstract beginning with no definitions, no strings attached to it, so to speak, and decided to create the world, I think that the average human being, within a relatively short period of time of discussion, of thought, could arrive to that conclusion that it must be.
Yeah, and I know it's not part of the first principle, but I just, even the prayers that we say on Shabbat,
Mm-hmm.
think is not the right word, but describe God in the prayers as something, he gets angry and.
We'll get to that. We're principle number 1 out of 13. Give me time.
Right. It's not.
Okay.
First
Now,
principle.
I missed an important point.
But that makes you think of God as not beyond the world, but part of anthropomorphic.
Very good.
Anthropomorphic idea of God.
So, we'll get. My experience has been for the average person. The average person is not some deep philosopher. Just average person has common sense. If you take the time to think about these issues in a structured way, largely arrive at very similar conclusions to what the Torah is describing. Most people don't give it the time to really think about it, or assume that because there's so many discussions, I'm not going to bother. I don't want to get into the argument. I'm going to rely on the experts. The Torah, by the way, this is not one of the 13 principles of faith, but it happens to be there is a mitzvah to learn these subjects. To learn the subjects. Because when you learn the subjects, it becomes more real.
Would it be logical to say that Bereshit means at point A?
Well, again, Bereshit means the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're going to take the view, as some even Orthodox Jews do, that the beginning was a process of evolution, then Bereshit would be the Big Bang.
Mm-hmm.
But what I am using in my terminology as point A, I mean the creator, not the Big Bang, but the one who started the Big Bang.
Yeah, conceptually, point A, where there's nothing driving it, it's undefined.
Okay.
That's Bereshit.
Okay. Now, however, this is all where it goes with logic. There is the last step, which is not purely logical, although there are logical underpinnings to it. The Jewish belief is not just that God created the world, but that the creation is a continuous process. And not just a continuous process that says that God is continuing to run and maintain the world, but rather that the default state of the universe is to not exist. And every second, if the universe continues to exist, it's because something continuously causes it to exist. And the moment God were to decide, if he ever does, I'm not interested anymore, he wouldn't need to destroy the world, but instead, the moment he's not interested, it's gone. I'm going to give you an example of that, although I'm not saying this is the way God creates the world, but I'll give you an example of the dependency, so you get an idea. Okay, I saw a Jewish professor in Montreal, Hasidic Jew. I saw once an article, he gave this example and I loved it. Okay, when you were a kid one time and your dad or your mom, when you complained I couldn't fall asleep, they said, go and count sheep. Go build houses in your mind, okay? So imagine you took that advice seriously. You're laying in your bed as a 7-year-old, and in your mind, you create an entire building, okay? Now, of course, in that the building I'm talking about right now doesn't exist, right? But whatever you will call that existence is totally and absolutely dependent on the mind of the child. If the child didn't think of this sheep doesn't exist. He didn't just think of 1,000 sheep. He has to think of sheep A, sheep B. Every second, the moment his mind goes off it, poof, it's gone. Because it never had any existence outside of his mind. So that, now, I'm not here to say the world doesn't exist. I'm here to say that in Jewish philosophy, our existence is so dependent, absolutely dependent every second on God's continuous calling us into existence, that the relationship is similar to that of the castles that you're building in your mind. So it gives you an idea. Now that is something, I don't have time to discuss it. I can give you certain logical ideas which makes it make more sense, but I can't prove it. Because, why can't I prove it? Because even if it makes more sense, God, because he is undefined, because he has no limits, any piece of logic I will tell you, it makes more sense that way. You could counter with that and say, well, God could have created the world with a trick you never thought of, right? However, it so happens to be that there are verses and prayers and essentially traditions, what Jewish people, what Judaism tell us, this is the way God creates the world. So yes, I believe it's more logical. I'm not going to tell you that it's something that could be proven. However, it is an article of faith in the Jewish religion that not only did God create the world, but God continuously creates the world. As we are speaking, we are being recreated again and again and
So
again.
where did Shabbat go?
That's a great question. You could ask a better question. If I look at myself in the mirror and I say I'm 50 years old, I'm not 50 years old. I'm 1 second old. I'm constantly being renewed. And the answer is just got to think differently. When you say something is 50 years old, what you're meaning to say is that God recreated the same thing in a certain process for 50 years in a row. Okay? When you're saying God rested on Shabbos, you don't mean he rested. He went to sleep and said, I'm forgetting about it when I worked hard. What you are saying is that for the first 6 days of creation, however you define that, God was adding new building blocks, adding new stages to the world he was creating. And then on the 7th day, he stood back and he said, now the world is going to run on a system which is going to seem as if it is self-perpetuating.
So we stopped creating and started making.
He stopped being creative.
Yes.
Okay. And that's why if you look into the rules of Shabbos, the things we're not allowed to do are not the things that are hard for us to do. It's not what decides what you are or not allowed to do on Shabbos. Generally speaking, the things you're not allowed to do are those things which are considered in Jewish tradition to be expression of creativity. But I want to go down that path. That's not a principal Jewish faith. Let's stick to the topic. I already spent more than 2/3 of my time, and I have 5 more principles to cover. Let's accelerate the process. Okay. Second principle is the unity of the Creator, and I'm going to read it again. Fran, I hope you're there. I don't see you and hear you. I hope you're there. And Lee, you're with us?
Yes,
You're quiet. It means I didn't say anything controversial yet.
I'm learning.
Okay. Second principle. I believe with perfect faith that the Creator, blessed be his name, is a unity, and that there is no unity in any manner like unto his, and that he alone is our God who was and is and will be. Now, I'm gonna explain this. Okay. First, a little logical experiment. Okay. How many of you thought of the idea, realized that if you're going to have the idea, suppose one day you decided they're not one God, there were 7 gods. That based on how we described the concept of God in principle number 1, it follows logically that there cannot be more than one of those.
Oh, that's
Did you realize
true.
that?
That's true.
So if anybody ever says, I believe that there are 3 gods or 7 or any number other than 1, that means that none of them are the real one. Why? Because in order for something to be 2 or any other number than 1, each of the 2 have to have a certain description that is only true for that and not for the other. One is blue and one is red. One is big and one is small. One is here, one is there. One is yesterday, one is tomorrow. How should I put this? If 2 drops of water are of exactly the same size and exist at exactly the same place at exactly the same time, then they aren't 2 drops of water. Then there is 1. There's the same. In order for something to be 2, what makes something 2 and not 1 is that one is this way and the second is the other way. There has to be some difference. And as soon as you define a being as having a property which defines it and limits it in some way, then that being is no longer point A in the process. Because then you ask, okay, who got that to be this way? Why is it this way? There's something preceding it, if not in time, then in logic. In logic, you know that the cause comes before the effect. Not always is there a differential difference in actual time, but in logic, certainly the cause came first and the effect came later, right? So if there is a God you believe in for some reason, that is God number 1, the God of fire, and the other one is the God of water. So that means there is a fire before God. And God is the God of fire. Boom, no more God. Because God is the one who is not defined by fire, water, or any definition whatsoever. The moment is defined, that means there is a definition that precedes him. That means he's no longer point number one. That means he's no longer God.
Well, we will ultimately define him, right?
No.
No, we'll give him characteristics,
We'll
attributes.
we'll describe how God decided to give himself attributes. It's like you put on a straight face if you ever ran a company or had employees and you were a manager. You took for yourself a certain persona that you put on when you dealt with the, in the office, and it stopped the moment you walked out. It was never the real you. Although when you acted that way, it expressed your true feelings, right? But it was not your natural you. You're taking on a certain persona to have a certain outcome, to have a relationship, the type of relationship you want with the people in the office or in your care. And the same is true, by the way, for your family, everything. An average person has different personas that he or she wears. And God decided to do the same thing, but it's not the real him. The real him is undefinable. And we'll get to that soon. But for now, let's understand that to say that there's only one God and not seven is, you don't need to be a great, believer to come to that conclusion. It's logic. On the contrary, if somebody says there are two gods, it simply doesn't make sense. It's either he doesn't understand what God means, what the word simply expresses, or he's simply fooling himself. Two gods doesn't make. So when we look at the various idol worshippers in previous, eras, and they believed in all types of gods, it's not as if they had one real one and the other ones were fake. They never began to understand, to the extent that the average person believed that these things are the top of the pyramid. They never began to understand what this is all about. We're going to learn soon, if we have time, that the leaders of the idol worshippers back then in the day actually weren't that foolish as we make them out to be. They had a certain philosophy which Judaism disagrees with. But the average person who thought there's the God of this star and the God of that star, it was total nonsense. Doesn't begin to appreciate what God means. And by the way, the average guy in the street probably didn't give it enough thought either. Not because they're foolish, just life is life. Nobody spends. You're too busy for that. But I maintain the average person on the street sit down and learn these topics we're learning now. They'll by and large agree. Differences, arguments, but by and large, we're not saying anything, extraordinary. However, let's take it a step further. Okay, we all know God has no body. Of course, he has no body, right? But if God has no definitions, that means he doesn't change with time.
Well, he created time.
He created time. Beautiful, right? Why didn't God, if God created the world, why didn't he create it 1,000,000 years before? He did.
Well, there was no military.
There was no time. Okay.
It's not a concept that existed.
So
Before what?
What?
The question actually is before what?
Yeah.
Very good. So now where faith comes in over here is to go a step further. When we pray, as we all should, I hope you do, and you say one of the most famous, most important Jewish prayers, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, right? Hashem Echad, God is one. Do you know what we're supposed to be thinking? If you look in the commentaries, look in some sitters have it in little letters. Here's what we're supposed to be thinking is that the word Echad, which means one, has 3 letters. The first letter is Aleph, which in numerology, it stands for 1, and that signifies that God is one. The second letter is Chet, 8. Now, I'm not going to tell you why in Judaism there is the idea of 7 heavens. I'm not going to hog the argument. I have an answer, but it's not for now. But if you take 7 heavens and our own world, you arrive 7 and 1 at 8. And you take Daled, which is 4 directions. What is the message you're supposed to think about? It's not just that there's one God up there in heaven, but there is somewhere, point A, there's one God. The idea we're supposed to be thinking about is a whole different concept, a much deeper concept, which is faith. And that is that everything that exists, including me and you and everything we deal with and everything that existed and will exist in the trillions of items and beings that exist out there in the world, are in the end expressions of God's unity.
Expressions of God.
God's unity.
Oh,
So there isn't God plus me.
That's right.
There isn't God plus a trillion things. God isn't one of a bunch of things that exist. There is, even after God created the world, what really exists out there?
only
God
unity.
exists.
Unity,
Do I exist?
of course.
Of course I exist. I'm not going to say that I'm a hoax, that I'm a hallucination. But my existence is not something that is extra and in addition to God's existence. Instead, even though God created the whole world and everything that's in it, he is still alone as he always was. How could that happen logically? How could that be? That requires a discussion. That requires a discussion that explains how, even though we exist, our existence is not important enough, big enough, real enough to affect God's existence and his unity. That's a discussion, and that's what we are supposed to ultimately arrive at when we say Shema. Shema is not to say God is one, there are not seven of them. What are we, fools? We think that maybe there would be seven gods. We have to sit there and say twice a day that there's only one God. Think about it one time, you realize it can't be anything but one God. There can't be seven of them. What we have to realize is that when you look around the various things that exist in nature and the powerful forces in nature and the powerful people in nature, and nature seems to be very, very big and powerful and important and it's real, right? And to say, you know what? All that really doesn't matter. The only thing that really is, there's nothing as real as God himself. That's something that is taking the idea of God's unity to a whole different level. That's what we're supposed to be working on when we say the Shema. And that's the ultimate idea of the second principle. Because again, God, one God and not seven or two or any other number, that's baby stuff. One God, and even though I exist, there's still only one God, not me and him. That is something you got to work on to realize how our reality is dependent on 1,000 things. And therefore, let me throw a logic out there, okay? There's a bird flying. I take a stone. Imagine I take a stone, I throw a stone so it makes the same arc. It goes up, flies 50 feet, and lands exactly like the bird does. Will you tell me that the stone is flying too?
No.
Well, I'll agree that the stone isn't flying. The bird flies on its own. Therefore, the flight is more real. The stone only flew because I made it. The stone doesn't have wings. It can fly on its own. I happened to inject some force in it, which made it fly temporarily. And as soon as the energy ran out, it fell back down. So therefore, which is more real in terms of flying? The bird's flight is considered to be more real than that of the stone. Okay, so it gives you, now take that logic and start thinking about whether I'm real or not. How many things have to be in place in order for me to exist?
Only God's desire that you exist.
Besides God's desire, I'm talking about physically. The more science learns, the more they realize how complex nature is, and how many things have to be just so that I could sit by this table and say I'm full of myself and say that I exist. Now, what does God need to exist? Nothing. So who is more real? Okay. Who is more real, me or God? Stop a guy in the street, he'll tell you, I am here, I can touch and feel myself. But God, I don't know, I can't see him. Think about it a little bit and realize God is real because he is. We, in our own little minds, we're full of ourselves, we think we are real. But when we compare our reality to God's reality, we realize, no, God exists. And he gave us a certain feeling of existence, but and that's true. I'm not going to say here that we are nobodies. But when we compare ourselves to God, we have to realize God remains one. God is not sitting there now with a whole bunch of buddies. God is as lonely as he always was. Because God, us and God are existing in two different realities. Our reality compared to God's is garnished as nothing. If we exist, it's because God is giving us an existence. So therefore, who exists? God. Okay, not enough because I have only 10 more minutes. I got 3 more principles to cover. Oh gosh, 7 more minutes. Okay, you with me, Lee and Fran?
Yes.
Let's take the third principle. I believe with perfect faith that the Creator, blessed be his name, is not a body, and that he is free from all accidents of matter, and that he has not any form whatsoever. When you think about this, this flows from what we have been saying until now. I'm not just saying that God doesn't have a physical body. Any culture that ascribed a physical form to their deity, to their God, is simply primitive. Okay, can we all agree on that? Okay. That God is some old man with a long stick that could fight, or that God is some, if you look at the old Babylonian culture, Mesopotamian cultures, and the Egyptians, all their forms that they had of God, taking some physical form, it's simple nonsense. It doesn't take much sophistication to realize that if you understand what the idea of God is supposed to solve in our understanding of the world and its origins, you realize that origin, that point A, by definition, obviously not a body. What do you mean a body? A physical thing.
Well, it's beyond physical because God created everything that's physical.
But then take it a step further, not just a physical body, even a spiritual body. In other words, let me ask you a question. I'm just giving you ideas. 2 + 2 equals?
4.
That's an idea. Is it real or fake?
Well,
It's a real idea.
it's real.
How old is it?
How old is it?
Yeah.
The principle always existed, whether we knew of it or
The
not.
answer is it's timeless, right?
Yes. Okay.
Where does it exist? Is it here or in the Middle East? It's spaceless, right?
Yes.
It's a principle that's not dependent on time and space, correct?
Right.
I have an argument against that.
Okay,
You have Sarah and Abraham.
correct.
How many are they?
How many Sarah and how many Abrahams?
No.
There are 2.
Their seed. How many are they?
Endless.
Okay. That's my argument.
Okay, I hear your point, but I'm trying to make I'm trying to express.
But
There are
principle.
Yeah, but 2 + 2 is 4, whereas 2 × 3 is 6. Correct? So here you have 2 logical ideas. Both are true, both are timeless, both are not dependent on space, and yet each is different than the other, right?
Mhm.
So you may call them spiritual beings, not beings that have a conscience, obviously, but spiritual items, because each is limited in their own construct. 2 + 2 is 4, 4 + 4 is 8. It's 2 different things based on the same principles in the end, but they're 2 different
It's
ideas.
independent of anything physical.
True. My point here is that when we say that God doesn't have a shape, we don't just mean that he's not square or a triangle, or that he's not male or female, or all these ideas. Obviously, it doesn't have a physical form. That goes without saying. But even a spiritual form doesn't make sense. Because, again, to go back to point A is a totally abstract form. It's not 2, 4, 6. It's not numbers. It's not ideas. It's not anything. Any type of definition you will try to give to God, by definition, has to fail. Okay? So to say that God is spiritual and not physical is equally foolish. Listen to this, okay? If I told you God is not red or not blue, you look at me and say, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? Of course he's not red and not blue. It's a childish thing to say because he never was something that's measured in color. Okay? Now, if I'm going to start telling you that God is not 4 or 8, or God is not large or small, or God is not deep, or God is not smart, or God is not benevolent, or God is not good or bad, or any of these things, that's equally senseless.
Well, I agree with you, but I think that the 2 things, the numbers versus colors, are different are different. One is a result of a physical action, light shining off an object, and our brain interpreting that as a color, and the other one exists whether we exist or not.
True.
That principle.
Spiritual ideas and objects are not dependent on physical time and space,
Yeah.
and don't have physical constructs. They don't have dimensions as physical objects. They're very true. But they have their own definitions that work for these spiritual realms.
Oh, I agree.
As soon as you use the term definitions, you know you can't be talking about God. Okay? Furthermore, let's talk about love for a second, just to give you an idea. How many novels, movies, or whatever do we hear about love is timeless and love is spiritual and love is amazing, right? Love is not defined. Love is boundless, right? Okay. If I'm going to tell you that God loves, that's equally senseless as saying that God was picking his ears. It's a total senseless meaning.
But our prayers say that kind of thing all the time.
We'll get there.
Okay.
First, we have to appreciate that God is totally abstract. Nothing you ever could think of, whether it's spiritual or physical, describes him. And even to say that God doesn't love as we do, even that statement is like a child saying God is not red. Meaningless. Okay, it's hard to wrap your mind around that, but it's a basic idea. Without that, if you don't believe that, if you don't realize that, then we're missing. Maimonides calls this one of the principles, one of the foundations of the Jewish religion. The moment you start thinking of God as, oh, God has to be good, because God is beneficent good. So God is good, the ultimate goodness, right? Ever heard that expression in English? Thank goodness. Very un-Jewish idea. Not because I believe God is bad or something. Of course not. But if you're going to describe God as goodness, then you lost the whole point. Goodness, spiritual or physical? Of course it's spiritual, goodness. But spiritual is also a definition. We're talking about something that doesn't define altogether. In fact, the very idea that today I'm in a good mood, today I'm in a bad mood, today I'm in a loving mood, tomorrow in an angry mood, that describes change. That describes something that's in addition to me. God doesn't have that. He is who he is. He's timeless, not just timeless, he can't be, by definition, can't be described in time. So it's hard to even begin to have a proper discussion about this without falling into that trap of giving God definitions. We don't have anything else that it's even in that category. We have to understand this and believe this. God doesn't have a physical body, doesn't have a spiritual body. God just is in a way that our mind simply could never comprehend, because we could only comprehend things we could wrap our mind around. God isn't such an object, so finished. Only thing we can know about God is that he exists. And the only thing else we can know is in the negative. He can't be this and he can't be that. He can't be this, he can't be something else. But anything positive, there's nothing we have to describe God, because he is indescribable. End of sentence. Two more principles, and it's 9. I'm running out of time. So do I have 5 minutes? Or do I have to push this up?
My daughter will be here.
Okay, fine. Fourth principle, believe with perfect faith that the Creator, blessed be his name, is the first and the last. Now, there's a lot to talk about this, but here's and I go back to what one of you said before, and I don't remember who. God is our creator. What do you mean? He is. What is God if not our creator? The answer is God is God. The fact that at some point in time, of course, there's no time. The fact that God decided to create us didn't turn him into a creator. From our perspective, that's what he is. But from God's perspective, what is he? He's God. Take away the world, add the world. Did God change? Well, he's unchangeable, so he didn't change. So the entire universe and everything that's in it, plus all spiritual realms, however defined, you want to learn Kabbalah, you want to learn philosophy, any spiritual construct is vast and big and important and real. I can give you a bunch of attributes. At the end of the day, it doesn't change God in any way. To the extent that we take it for granted that the world will not exist forever. And there's something like that in Judaism, which is hard to describe. The world as we know it is going to change. Some interpret it to mean that it will actually be destroyed one day. I'm not going there for now. One thing we have to remember, that as a logical exercise, God doesn't need the world. not before he created it. And even when the world finishes, if it ever does, God will still be the same. He doesn't become dependent on us because he created us. He doesn't need us in any way, shape, or
Do
form.
you have purpose?
Pardon?
Do you have purpose?
Great question. The logical question is, if God created the world for a purpose, it presumes that God needs us or needs the world to accomplish something. And without us doing that, the purpose will be missing. So God is missing something. That's a great question. And that's in the same family of questions, which John was asking about God. It says in the Torah that God loves, and it says that God is angry, and it says in the Torah that God is wise. Many things it describes about God. And ultimately, as Jewish philosophy answers it one way, the Kabbalah answers it in a slightly different way. Ultimately, yes, God decides voluntarily, so to speak, to put himself into a certain construct, persona, perhaps is a better word. And within that persona, he needs this and he wants this and he loves something else. And all that is true. It's not fake. But
That's the way
just
we
like
understand it.
you could walk away from your job where while you're on the job, people know you as the tough boss or the great manager or whatever it may be, right? And that's true while you're there because you decided to wear that persona, but you could take it off in an instant. Actually, maybe not. Maybe you work so hard and it becomes part of you, it's hard. Okay. But theoretically, at least, this is only the way I am 9 to 5. I go home, I'm now a father or a husband or whatever, or a good buddy, and everything else doesn't matter. Right. In the same way, that could be true. That's true for the real God beyond all that. And yes, he doesn't need us.
Yes, he does. Or
He
does
doesn't
not?
need us.
Doesn't.
He doesn't need it. He doesn't need the world, anything in there. It has to be. Anything else would be illogical. And finally, fifth principle. I believe with perfect faith that to the Creator, blessed be his name, and to him alone, it is right to pray, and it's not right to pray to anybody being beside him. I'm losing my crowd. I'm afraid we're going to have to talk about this next week instead of now. But that is an extremely important idea in Judaism, that God still holds all the power. It's not as if God is the ultimate point A, but power devolved from him to a bunch of subsidiaries. No. Ultimately, power is ascribed to God himself and no one else. And it means two things. It means on the one hand, there's no angel, there's no king, there's no person, there's no anything that you could pray to and ask him to change things.
Before
Because-
creation, power with respect to what?
There you go. Good. But then on the second hand, also is a very powerful concept. The little me, whoever small you think you are, you could be a nobody. You have the ability to turn around to God himself and pray to him. It's a two-way thing. I want to expand about it on more, but unfortunately, it's going to have to wait until next week. Did I lose all participants?
See you next week.
Good night.
Oh, I lost one of them. Okay. I went 9
I know.
9:06.
I more than believe. I
Pardon?
know.
Thank you. Okay.
All right, Rabbi, we'll